I'm Cornell Clayton, Director of the Foley Institute, and on behalf of the Institute, let me welcome you out to our event today. This is another one in our ongoing series on the 2024 election. Every Tuesday we have a speaker this semester, so I encourage you to come out to our other ones. Next week we have Seth Maskett, in fact, from the University of Denver. He'll be talking about the GOP and Trump, so it should be an interesting talk. Today, though, we're very fortunate to have with us someone's going to be talking about, this was perfect timing, and I'd like to take credit for it, but I didn't, I had no idea when we lined up Pavielle. She's going to be talking about presidential rhetoric, and of course we have the first presidential debate tonight at 6 p.m., so I encourage you all to tune into that. And by the way, right after that, there's the gubernatorial debate, which should be quite good too, so I encourage you to watch both of those. But let me introduce now Pavielle Haines. She's an assistant professor in the Department of Politics and Philosophy at the University of Idaho. She specializes in identity politics, political behavior, public opinion, and American politics. Her current work examines how presidential candidates use rhetoric to shape public attitudes about American identity. Pavielle holds bachelor's degrees in both political science and psychology from Montana State University, and she received her PhD from the Department of Politics at Princeton University. Her research was awarded the Best Dissertation in Political Psychology by the American Political Science Association in 2019. And she has published in some of the leading journals in political science, including the American Political Science Review and Perspectives on Politics. So join me now in welcoming Pavielle Haines to the podium.
All right, thank you so much for having me here. It's a real pleasure to be at WSU today. So today I want to spend some time with you thinking about patriotic campaign rhetoric. So when presidential candidates go on the campaign trail and they say things like, "I'm so proud to be an American," or "I love my country," what effect does that have historically, right? How have patriotic appeals been used? And then if we think ahead, right, to the 2024 election, what can we expect to see there? What might happen with patriotic rhetoric in the lead up to Election Day? So historically, Republican presidential candidates have sort of owned the issue of patriotism. And by that I mean that when patriotism becomes salient in an electoral context, it usually benefits the Republican candidate more so than the Democratic candidate. And so if we think back to the 2016 election, which I don't know how many of you remember that very clearly. It's been a hot minute, right? A lot has happened, right? But certainly we had Trump, right? His campaign slogan was "Make America Great Again," right? So patriotism, this notion of sort of a focus on our country and this desire for greatness and identity was at the forefront. And he would often sort of link this idea of making America great again with protecting it against sort of the alleged cultural threat posed by immigrants and minorities, right? Those two things went hand in hand for him. And then Clinton, for her part, sort of fumbled a little bit with this question of patriotism. She would frequently retort, "Well, America is already great," and that sort of was meant to showcase her sense of patriotism and repudiate any implied ethnocentrism, but it largely sort of fell flat. And this was nothing new, right? This pattern had been repeating itself again and again from about the 1980s onward. And so how is it that Republicans came to own the issue of patriotism? How did they sort of claim that? Well, I think there are basically four elements related to Republican ownership of patriotism that are all mutually reinforcing. So the first is that the public regards Republican candidates as being more credibly patriotic. The second is that when we look at their campaign speeches, they're more likely to invoke patriotism. They make more frequent use of patriotic appeals. They also have control over the meaning of patriotism. They have crafted a narrative related to patriotism and American identity, right, that helps them to advance a particular brand. It helps them not just to win votes, but to advance policy goals. And when we think about, well, who benefits from invoking patriotism, it is primarily Republican candidates. So we're going to take a closer look at each of these elements and how they've panned out historically, and then we'll skip forward to where we're at today with 2024. And so we'll start with this idea that Republicans are seen as being more credibly patriotic. And we don't have to go back very far to see that this is the case. We can just look at some recent surveys that have been put out there in the last couple of years. So we have a poll from 2022 that showed that 56% of voters characterized the Republican Party as being patriotic, but only about 46% said the same as the Democratic Party. Poll from 2023, 63% of Americans view Republicans in general as being patriotic, compared to just 48% who said the same thing about Democrats. And then we've got a poll from 2023, where 43% of voters said that they felt that the GOP was closer to their personal view of patriotism, while just 29% said that the Democratic Party was closer to their view of patriotism. And then we can even go to 2024. This is before Biden dropped out, right? So we don't have Harris yet when this poll was taken. But a poll of battleground states found an 11-point advantage for Republican candidates on being patriotic. Right, so across the board, we see the data shows us again and again, when people think about patriotism, they think of the Republican Party. The Democratic Party is not the first thing that comes to mind. And so that's sort of right, first check on the idea of Republican ownership of patriotism. How did they get there? Well, this is where we have to get into some of these other elements. So let's take a look at how different candidates have used patriotic appeals over the years. Okay, so this is some data from my own work. This bar chart shows the percentage of sentences in each of the major presidential candidates' campaign speeches from 1980 through 2016. The red bars are our Republican candidates, the blue bars are our Democratic candidates. And so a couple of things should stick out to you if you're looking at this. So the first thing is that in every election cycle, upwards of about 4 to 5% of every candidate's sentences include something about patriotism. Now think about how many things candidates have to cover on the campaign trail. Policy, right? Sort of advancing a personal brand, demonstrating credibility and their qualifications. They have to do a lot. So 4 to 5% of their sentences devoted to patriotism, and sometimes a lot more. That is a whole heck of a lot of time spent on trying to, cram this message down voters' throat that, hey, I'm proud to be an American. I love my country. The second thing, though, that we should notice is that Republicans are just consistently using patriotism a whole lot more than their Democratic counterparts. So on average, right, over this time period, Republicans devoted about 10% of their sentences to trying to say something about patriotism, versus just about 7 or 8% of the sentences used by Democrats. And in some years, the difference is actually even larger. So if we look at 2016, that in particular is a huge gap. We can see that Trump was using patriotism in about 14% of his sentences, versus Clinton using maybe about 6 or 7% of her sentences to talk about patriotism. So Trump was twice as likely to invoke patriotism as Clinton was in 2016, and we can see that that's pretty consistent with a lot of previous years as well. So second check, right? We see that Republicans are more likely to invoke patriotism. They use it a whole lot more frequently. But does this buy them anything, right? Because they can talk about patriotism all they want, but at the end of the day, it has to get them something, or whether or not they own it is kind of a moot point, right? What's the point of owning something if it doesn't advantage you in some way? And so that's where we get to these last two things: control over the meaning of patriotism, as well as votes. Before we get to votes, let's think a little bit about control over the meaning of patriotism. So at the start of this talk, I mentioned how Trump invoked patriotism in a way that was critical of immigrants and so-called outsiders. And this also had precedent. He was not the first Republican candidate to do this. So in my work, I try to better understand what sort of message are candidates trying to convey about the nature of American identity when they invoke patriotism. And so what I do is I look at, okay, they make a patriotic appeal. They say something like, I love this country. I'm proud to be an American. What do they say right before or right after that? Is it something like, I love this country and we need to stem the tide of immigrants. They're ruining our country, right? Well, that's meant to convey something about, hey, it's patriotic to sort of want to be anti-immigrant. And so I would have classified something like that as a negative reference to diversity, right? A coupling of patriotism with negative attitude about a racial or ethnic group. On the flip side, we also might see that candidates sometimes say things like, I'm proud to be an American and we're a nation of immigrants. Is that positive or neutral? Is it just a statement of fact? It's not clear, right? But clearly they're linking the two in some way. And so I would classify something like that as positive neutral. And so I wanted to see what percentage of patriotic appeals have sort of these couplings over time. And these charts are kind of complicated to understand, but here is the upshot. When we look at Democratic candidates, what we can see is that on the whole, they couple far fewer of their patriotic appeals with some sort of reference to diversity in general, right? So about 7% of their patriotic appeals are coupled with a positive or neutral reference to diversity, and about 4.1 are coupled with a negative reference to diversity. So not as much as Republicans. And when they do it, right, they're more likely to connect it with sort of a positive reference to diversity, to say something like immigrants are what make us a great nation. Republican candidates are more likely to, on the whole, couple their patriotic appeals with some sort of reference to diversity, and when they do, it's quite a bit more likely to be negative. And if we look at 2016, right, so this is Trump, and this is the percentage of sentences or patriotic appeals that he coupled with a negative diversity reference. So about a quarter of all of his patriotic references went hand in hand with something about, like immigrants or people of color or a threat, right? Something like that. And so if we put all of this together, right, Democrats are talking about patriotism less. They are not, when they do, they're not necessarily consistently advancing or trying to advance in a narrative about American identity. Meanwhile, Republicans very much are. They're referencing patriotism a lot, and they're trying to build a narrative when they do. And so does this actually have an effect on public attitudes, right? The short answer seems to be yes. So to test for this, I did a survey experiment of white Americans. I asked them some demographic questions, and then I had them read a short little news article. And this is happening in 2015 when I did this. I've replicated it since. But in this news article, they read about two fictitious candidates. They're told, hey, the parties are trying to vet possible candidates. They want people to evaluate them. And they get one of three versions of the news article. In one version, neither candidate invokes patriotism. They're both quoted on sort of the importance of the upcoming election. And then in the other two, either the Democratic candidate or the Republican candidate invokes patriotism, right? Afterwards, I asked people a few questions about, well, which candidate do you like better? And also, how do you feel about various social groups in the United States? And then at the very end, I also asked them about their sense of American identity. And here are some of the results in terms of what is the effect of that narrative, that historical narrative that we've seen. Oh, before we do that, just so you get a sense of what the respondents saw. There was the control quote. There are many challenges that must be faced, but I believe that people already know this. They must show courage and wisdom. And here's the patriotic version. There are many challenges that this country must face, but I believe in the greatness of our country and am proud to call myself an American. and confident in the courage and wisdom of the American people, right? So either the Democrat or the Republican would say that. All right, so here are the results from that. So when white respondents with a strong sense of American identity were exposed to the Republican candidate invoking patriotism, they became more favorable toward their own racial group while also expressing greater hostility or negativity toward other groups. So here's what it looks like in the control when patriotism isn't mentioned at all. So the respondents rated their feelings towards whites as being at about 75, and this is going from 0, which is very cold, they feel very cold towards them, all the way up to 100, which is very warm. So they like whites the best, right? 75. They put their feelings towards African Americans at about 61, and they put their feelings towards immigrants at about 54. What happens? Well, before we do, here's the difference there. We can see 14-point difference and a 20.5-point difference. What happens for the respondents who hear or read about the Republican candidate invoking patriotism? Well, things shift. The first thing we see is that they become even more favorable towards their fellow whites. Their attitudes towards whites go up to about 84 points. Meanwhile, their attitudes towards African Americans become more cool and drop to about 50 points. And we see a very big drop in their attitudes towards immigrants, down to 39 points. So now we've got a 34-point difference in how they feel about whites versus African Americans, and a 45-point difference in how they feel about whites versus immigrants. And it's really important to note that in my little experiment here, the patriotic appeal is not being coupled with any sort of negative diversity reference. It is literally just the patriotic appeal, right? It is just this, I love my country. And so what is going on here? Well, my hypothesis, and this sort of bears out with some other work that I've done, is that Republican candidates over the years have coupled, right, patriotism with sort of hostility towards minorities so frequently that they don't even need to do it anymore, right? When they invoke patriotism, very often it is just implied that, oh yeah, patriotism, and part of that is sort of favoritism for the true Americans who happen to be white, right? So this really does suggest that they have cultivated a narrative that is powerful, and they do have a lot of control over the nature of American identity when they invoke patriotism. Now you may want to know, well, where are the results for the Democratic condition? What happens when people read about a Democrat making the exact same identical patriotic appeal? And the answer is there's nothing to see. There is no effect. So that's kind of puzzling. What is going on there? Well, it kind of seems like people just don't regard that Democrat making that appeal as being credible. They don't have a sense of, oh, when a Democrat makes this appeal about patriotism, it means this about American identity. They don't make that connection in the same way that they make it when the Republican makes the appeal. So that's kind of the third check. We see that Republicans have control over the meaning of patriotism. And then, of course, right, at the end of the day, maybe the most important thing, if we're thinking about 2024 especially, is, well, what's the electoral effect of all of this? What electoral advantage do candidates get from invoking patriotism? And so if we look at the results from that same experiment that I just explained, right, the electoral piece, we can see that when the Democratic candidate makes a patriotic appeal, they get a little bit of a boost. They get a 4.5 percentage point boost. But when the Republican candidate makes the appeal, they get a 9.1 percentage point boost. So, right, people reward the Republican candidate more for making the same patriotic appeal. What's going on here? Again, it's a credibility thing, right? So when the Republican candidate makes the appeal, people go, yeah, I feel that in my gut, right? I really feel like they are truly patriotic. They mean this. I really like this guy. I'm gonna vote for them. When a Democrat makes the same appeal, it's sort of like, are they just paying lip service to the idea of patriotism? Yeah, I don't know. I'm not sure that this sways my vote choice, right? That seems to be what is happening there. And right, so on all four fronts, we can see how Republican ownership over patriotic rhetoric has developed over the last 40 years or so. But now I want to skip ahead to think about what could go on with 2024, and if there's a possibility that this could be changing. If the Democrats have the opportunity in this moment to try and reclaim patriotism. Because if you watch the Democratic National Convention, you probably noticed that it was rife with patriotic symbolisms, speakers, and appeals. And so based on that, it certainly does look like Harris and the Harris campaign is trying to make a play for ownership over patriotism. And more than that, right, they seem to be trying to craft a particular narrative about patriotism, one that is sort of more progressive and based in inclusivity. So can they do this? Is this going to pay off for them? Is it going to be successful? And I want to be clear that at this point, we're moving beyond data and empirics into speculation. But, sort of taking a reasoned, scholarly approach to it, I do think they have a shot. And there are a couple of reasons why. So, first reason that they might have this window of opportunity is simple demographic change, right? So, as boomers die out, our electorate is becoming increasingly filled with millennials and Gen Z voters, as well as becoming less white. There are more people of color. And when we look at, well, how do they feel about patriotism? When we look at survey data of these groups, we can see that they're actually pretty skeptical of the idea of patriotism. And I see a few of you nodding your heads, right? Many of you are from this demographic group, and you're like, yeah, I don't know about this patriotism thing, right? Well, if they're not sort of loving the idea of patriotism, inevitably over time, the Republican brand of patriotism and patriotic rhetoric is going to lose currency. Now, what is unclear is it that these folks just don't like patriotism as a concept, that they find patriotism to be distasteful or problematic in some way, or is it that they don't like how it has been used in the past? And if it's the latter, right, then they might be open to a rebranding of it, and we could see it be highly effective. But at the very least, right, these old school Republican patriotic appeals are probably not going to be working on these voters. We also see shifts in how the Republican Party has sort of approached the issue of patriotism post-Trump. So in 2016, if you look at the way that Trump talked about patriotism and the way he used it, it was very much in line with sort of historical narratives that the Republican Party had established. He towed the line. Not so much in 2020, right? Things have shifted a lot since then, and he's flouted a lot of the tried and true GOP's patriotic tropes. So one of them was being very deferential to veterans, to really honoring the military. Trump's had issues in this area, right? He's called fallen soldiers, quote unquote, losers. There was the scandal kind of in Arlington Cemetery where he took video and photos of him politicking in front of soldiers' gravestones. At one point he gave a thumbs up in front of the gravestone. That's very much out of character with how the Republican Party has tried to depict themselves as being patriotic in the past. Another thing that the Republican Party has done as part of their patriotic brand is avoiding harsh criticisms of the country. And in fact, right, they've labeled people who bring up critiques as being unpatriotic in the past. But Trump has literally called the United States a failing nation, right? So that's also sort of out the door. And so where is he going with this? It's not entirely clear, but what is clear is that the patriotic narrative that the Republican Party has spent the last 40 years cultivating has largely been undone in this moment, and there's not a clear alternative in place. And so that leaves an opportunity, right? There's a chance for the Democratic Party to come in, swoop in, and say, all right, if you're not going to be the standard bearer for patriotism, we'll do it. Right? So if this is going to work out for the Harris-Walz campaign, they have to sort of make headway in all four of these areas. They have to ultimately convince people that they're more credibly patriotic. They have to sort of Trump when it comes to how often they're using patriotic appeals. They have to take control of the meaning of patriotism. And then, right, hopefully at the end of all of that, if you're them, they're hoping that, hey, maybe we'll get an electoral advantage from doing all this. So when we think about how they're doing on these fronts, again, it looks like they're making some headway. Right, so if we're thinking about the credibility gap in terms of patriotism, we have a recent YouGov poll that found that 53% of Americans viewed Harris as patriotic, while 57% viewed Trump as patriotic. So the gap is not totally gone, right? There's a 4-point difference there. But if we think about, well, how does that compare to a few years ago? If we go back to 2008, 56% viewed Obama as patriotic, while 74% viewed McCain as patriotic, right? That's a much, much larger gap. And what we've actually seen is that since 2008, the patriotic credibility gap has shrunk a little bit each year, and it's getting much closer. And then in terms of the rhetorical gap, right, it's hard to know what the numbers are going to be at the end of the day, right? We have to wait for things to pan out, and then we can look at the campaign speeches and see how often each candidate referenced patriotism. But it really does seem like Harris is leaning into this ideal of patriotism. She has a whole stump speech organized around the idea of fighting for the promise of America. She's repeatedly mentioned how much she loves her country. And one thing that I think is fascinating, actually, on this is that she openly criticized Gaza protesters for burning an American flag, which is actually very much in line with how a Republican 15, 20 years ago would have behaved, more so than a Democrat, right? She's actually taking a page out of the playbook of how Republicans have defined patriotism in the past and incorporating it into her own campaign. So what about the narrative? Well, Harris is definitely trying to develop a more progressive patriotic narrative. And like I said, it's possible that this resonates well with younger voters and people of color, or it could fall flat. But, right, she does have that opportunity, so we'll see if it plays out. And then, is this actually going to benefit her? Is she going to win more votes because of this? Well, it's hard to predict, right? But I also will say I don't think that what she is doing can hurt her in any way, right? Sometimes if you know your opponent owns an issue, it can be sort of a bad idea to bring it up a lot, right? If people see you as being much less patriotic, you don't want to make patriotism a talking point, right? That can hurt you, that can backfire. But I think we're in a moment where that's not the case, right? That the more Harris talks about patriotism, it may not pan out. It may not benefit her, but it is certainly not going to have, I think, a backlash effect. She can only benefit from doing this in this particular moment. Because at the end of the day, patriotism is what we make it. So I'm going to stop there. I want to leave some time for questions and discussion.
We have about a little over 20 minutes for some Q&A.
Maybe I'll just start real quick. I think you're dead right about what's going on with patriotism and democratic efforts to reclaim it and redefine it. The other issue they're trying to reclaim, you saw it at the convention, is freedom. Mm-hmm. And so do you think the same thing's going on there?
I think it's a similar thing, right? Certainly in the past, when we thought about survey data that asked, well, which party does better on the issue of freedom? It was consistently the Republican Party, right? The party of small government, and we don't want to interfere with your lives. But with the reversal of Roe in particular, I think there is, the tides are shifting. So yeah, I think it's a similar process happening with that as well. Yeah.
In regards to your survey experiment, did you also look at potential subsequent changes in policy attitudes?
Yeah, so I did, and it does seem as though, particularly on the immigration issue, right, we see a shift, and when people get this Republican patriotic appeal, all of a sudden they want harsher, more strict laws related to immigration. So yeah, it tracks. It's not just about how you feel about these groups, but also the types of policies you want directed toward them.
looking at the disparity in the view of who's patriotic or not, particularly between Obama and McCain, there's an easy answer for why that happened. So looking at 2024 with both J.D. Vance having 4 years in the Marine Corps as a corporal and Tim Walz having a career retirement as a command sergeant major from the Minnesota National Guard, how do you think their appeals and their credibility for patriotism will affect the presidential candidates' results?
Gosh, that is such a tough question, and I honestly don't have a great answer. I mean, we've had, veterans who were Democrats in the past run, and it hasn't helped us very much, right? So we'll have to see. I think my sense is that Walz has a shot at swaying military members. More so than maybe he would have 5, 6, or 7 years ago, for sure. But it'll be interesting to watch. And I'm sure it's going to come up in debates.
Thank you.
Hi, Pavielle. My name is Olivia Chrisley. I'm an assistant professor here at WSU. And so it's so nice to meet you and following your work for some time. And I'm curious to hear your thoughts on, in your experiment, you're kind of referring to this idea of negative diversity, and as a comparative politics scholar who also studies the U.S. I'm used to talking about that in terms of patriotism and nativism.
Yeah.
And it seems like what you're describing is this kind of Republican co-optation of patriotism and conflating it with nativism.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm curious to hear your thoughts on if Harris uses this diversity message that's straying too close to that conflation almost of the patriotism and nativism problem.
Yeah.
And I wonder if she were to keep it more focused on just the country and the pride in the country and not emphasize, if we're trying to stop conflating patriotism with nativism, does it stand to reason that perhaps she shouldn't lean into any type of reference, something that could trigger xenophobia?
Got it. From a normative perspective, I'm not going to try to go there, but just in terms of a strategy perspective, I think she sort of has to. I think what all my research shows is that patriotism on its own can be a potentially powerful sort of force and help candidates on the campaign trail, but the power really comes from this conflation, right? From going beyond just, oh, I'm so proud to be an American, to, well, what does that mean, right? Americans want to be told, well, what should I do with that? What does it mean to love my country? What does that actually look like? Who do I count as a fellow American? And especially if we're trying to think about younger voters, people of color, I don't think just saying, oh, I'm so proud to be an American is going to do it for them, right? They are skeptical of patriotism. If they're going to be brought along, it needs to be rebranded for them in some way. Would be my take on it, right? In terms of strategy, what does she need to do? I think she has to sort of sell some sort of narrative about American identity here. I don't want to neglect this side of the room too much, so I'm gonna go over there and then I'll come back.
So with the thing of Republicans owning patriotism, love of country, isn't that because they love their country and the Democrats hate the country? I mean, they are the ones who don't like all the whites. They don't like one of the founders and all of that.
Right. Okay, so so I think one of the things that is tricky here, and what makes this so slippery when you're trying to study it, as I've learned, is what does it mean to love your country? What is patriotism? It's subjective, right? And so certainly, one person might say, well, patriotism is all about, celebrating the founders and loving the Constitution, and, not being too harsh or critical of your country. And other people might say, no, loving your country is about trying to make it better by pointing out its flaws. Not because you hate it or dislike it, but because you want it to be better and you have to identify where improvement is needed. And so Democrats and Republicans have historically had very different ideas about what it means to be patriotic. Who is right? You guys get to decide that for yourselves, right? But I think, certainly in terms of which brand or of patriotism have voters found more compelling in the past, it's the Republican brand, for sure. Is that changing? Possibly. But it's slippery.
Okay. It kind of in line with Dr. Chrisley's question, I guess, it seems to me this concept of patriotism, at least in the Republican branding, resonates somewhat with symbolic racism measures as well as nativism appeals and things like that. So I'm wondering if, and I'm asking you to speculate, sorry in advance, I'm wondering if Democrats are successful in maybe implementing this rebranding of patriotism. What types of rhetorical strategies might we see in the Republican Party that would still demonstrate a similar effect in the upcoming election in terms of this in-group preference being increased and the out-group being increased?
I mean, with Trump, he's not following the script, so I can't tell you what Trump will do. If, let's say, next election cycle, right, Democrats have maybe made some headway with rebranding patriotism, and we get a more sort of traditional Republican candidate in the next election cycle, what could happen? I mean, it could go either way. In 2010, 2011 sort of era, right, the Republicans were talking about we need to be a party that's more inclusive, and then that all sort of, changed as things progressed. It could go either way. They could say, well, okay, this type of patriotism is seeming to work, let's also lean into it, or they could back off of patriotism, or they could double down. And my guess might be that they'd initially double down, but it's not going to work for very long, right? Over time, that demographic shift is going to catch up with them, and then they're going to sort of be forced to change their strategy. Yeah.
Do you have any other instances of countries, like democratic countries, where a certain party has had an appeal to patriotism as much as America has?
So I haven't looked at any because I just focus on the US, but I can tell you there is something kind of unique about the US in terms of patriotism. Historically, when you look at cross-national surveys that ask people how patriotic are you or how much pride you have for your country, it's exceptionally high in the US compared to other countries. And so other countries, right, these patriotic appeals maybe not quite as salient, but I wish I knew the answer to your question more specifically. But yeah, I've just focused primarily on the US. I'm gonna hop back over here for a minute and
I noticed in the 90s that patriotic appeals were quelled on both sides.
Mm-hmm.
Have you looked at under what conditions voters seem to care more or less about patriotism?
Yeah, I've done a little bit of work in that area, and that's sort of where I'm headed right now, is to think about when does patriotism become more or less salient. I mean, certainly, right, we see an enormous surge right after 9/11, which makes perfect sense. When we have a national crisis, patriotism becomes much more salient. But I haven't found any consistent predictors yet. It's still a work in progress, but it's a great question.
Thank you for the presentation. I'm studying management information systems, so I'm interested in your view about how misinformation and fake news may have played a role in shaping public's opinion of these rhetorics.
Yeah, I mean, I think they're sort of two separate things, largely, although I will say that I think with the sort of the rise of misinformation, there's increasingly this sense that, well, if anything can be fake, everything can be fake, and it's just a matter of what's convenient for me to decide is fake news. And so my guess would be that we might see people, like if we think about the Arlington Cemetery, and what happened there, right? People who are very supportive of Trump and also consider themselves highly patriotic might dismiss that as fake news, right? They might find a way to say, oh, that's just fake news. It doesn't, it's irrelevant. It doesn't matter. So I think it can play into it, but only in the same way that, right, fake news has sort of infected everything, every type of rhetoric, right?
Thank you.
Yes.
So you talk about like patriotism moving over to like the Democratic side and being a very strong point for them now, or much stronger than it was in recent years.
Potentially, yeah.
But I was wondering if anything else has changed. Like I know a big thing is that Republicans are doing for the economy. However, like Democrats have been making huge strides to try and take ownership of that and say we do a great job as well, or we do a better job. But
Yeah.
so is that going to shift over in New Year's? And if that does, like, what do the Republicans do? Like, what do they take ownership of and say we're the party for this?
Yeah, so I mean, when you think about what are the things Republicans own, patriotism, defense, and the economy, right? So those are some big ones. And I think you're right. I think Democrats are also making a play for the economy in this moment. But, right, the same uphill battle in terms of they're trying to reclaim patriotism. It's going to be an uphill battle to reclaim the idea of, hey, we actually are the better party for economic growth and a strong economy. What's left for the Republicans? I mean, I think international relations, the military, certainly they're still very strong on that, and I don't see too much of an effort by the Democrats to try and change that anytime in the near future.
So in the presentation, you mentioned that in the post 2016 and beyond, the Republican Party has moved away from the more traditional values of patriotism into the more negative connotations with other groups of people aspect of it. And I was wondering if you could see a return to the more traditional values in a potential post-Trump GOP.
Yeah, absolutely. The catch is we just don't know what the party is going to ultimately look like post-Trump, right? It's still very much in flux, and until Trump himself is no longer a key figure, right? And the dust has to settle a little bit before we know what that is going to look like. But I do think it's possible that they try to return to that, and will it work for them? I think it depends on how effective Democrats are at reclaiming it in this particular moment, right? They may return to it and realize, hey, this doesn't work anymore for us, or maybe it will still, but they're gonna have a run for their money, whichever direction they go would be my bet. They're gonna have to work a little harder at it.
I noticed that your analysis started with 1980, with the election rebellion. And I wonder if you've done any work that goes back farther, and if there was a shift in the 80s. And I say this, I had, one of my grandmothers was a strident Democratic organizer, fundraiser, had a flag outside her house that had flown above the Capitol. If you opened her jewelry box, it was full of rhinestone flags. Also donkeys, but lots of flags. And I suspect now, if I just wandered into her house, if I could go back, I would think, oh, aside for the donkeys, I would think this is probably a Republican household. And I wonder if, and she was very active in the 40s, 50s, 60s. If you think there's been a shift in the 80s that has redefined patriotism.
So actually, I think the shift happened a little earlier. I think the shift happened in the 60s, primarily with Vietnam War protests and flag burning, and the civil rights movement. A lot of things happened in that moment, and that's kind of when Republicans started advancing also this particular brand of patriotism that they've maintained. Why do I start in the 80s? Because campaign speeches, transcripts of campaign speeches before that are hard to find. But a lot of historians have looked at this, and they all kind of point to the 60s as being this pivotal moment when all of a sudden patriotism starts to become a Republican thing. Much more so than, hey, Democrat, Republican, we can all be patriotic. That's when the shift happens. So I'm just sort of picking up a little later in that process.
I got another question, nobody else does. So I'm wondering if you see any shift in the Republican conception of American identity taking place under Trump. And what makes me ask that question is I was struck by J.D. Vance's speech at the convention, where he went on a little riff about what it means to be an American, and he criticized liberals and Obama-style rhetoric of America as an idea. It's a commitment to certain ideals, the Lincolnian notion of American identity. And he says, no, he says it's not a commitment to an idea, it's a place, and it's a people.
Yep.
The whole, sort of the blood and soil conception of national identity. I mean, is that a shift you see, or is it just a natural progression of what's been going on, or is it something radically different?
I think it's a natural progression, more than anything. And there's actually some great survey data on this in the General Social Survey, if you ever want to take a peek at that. But they ask people a few questions about what is important for being a good American. And they ask things like commitment to the laws and sort of ideals of your country, as well as being born in your country, right? Blood and soil. What are some of the others that they ask about? I'm trying to think, it's been a hot minute. But they get at this question of is it commitment to a set of ideals, or is it a commitment to place? And what we see is that it's a bit of both for Republicans, even still, but that idea of commitment to place, of having been born here, of speaking English, that's one of them, right? Having been born here, speaking English, those have become kind of more important post-Trump. That more of them say, actually, that matters a lot too, in addition to the commitment to ideals and respecting the laws of your land, yeah. So I do think a shift has happened. Is it a wholesale shift? No, but yeah, we do see some changes in how people think about this post-Trump, for sure. Is that down to Trump? I don't know, but the shift is there.
I'll just piggyback on that to say that we've seen a global shift in more of this commitment to blood and soil type nationalism.
The right-wing nationalist push.
So I mean, whether Trump is part of the broader movement, or it's a feedback loop, between the European far right and Trump and whatever else. But we've seen increases across the board in expressions of preference for a blood and soil type of nationalist rhetoric.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Any other questions? If not, I think I'll ask you to join me in thanking Pavielle Haines.